Today we're going to look at case usage. So in general, cases are used to show the particular job a noun or an adjective is doing in a sentence. The nominative is really pretty clear, and that is not something that your book really discusses. It is only used for the subject of a sentence or a predicate nominative with a verb like sum or videor or fio. And the vocative, of course, is only used when we directly address someone. But for the other four cases, the genitive, the dative, the accusative, the ablative, there are multiple ways in which Latin will use these, and you have really only learned one use, essentially, for each one of these. So remember, we use the genitive to show possession, the dative for indirect object, the accusative for direct object, and the ablative with prepositions to mean with or by. And of course, we've seen other prepositions that take either the accusative or the ablative, but those seem like just sort of specialized uses. I want, for those of you for whom this might be helpful, to break this down a bit and think more broadly about the job. That is, why did this language develop cases in the first place? And that is because they show slightly different things, and that means that they're going to be used in other ways as well in the language, but ways that are pretty consistent with their original meaning or our understanding of them. So the genitive really shows where something comes from or its origin. So that's why we use it for possession. That is, if the book is yours, it originates with you. And so possession is something that makes sense. But we're going to see it in some other uses too, which are not possession, but where often I think the context will make it clear why it's in the genitive. The dative is always something that is not intimately or directly related to the sentence. So it's sort of always indirectly related to the sentence. It's always sort of toward the side. And we're going to see how that works in a lot of cases too. The accusative is always the object of the sentence, or it is something that is what the sentence is aiming toward. So if you think about prepositions like ad and in, take the accusative to show motion because they're going toward or to something. And that's why. And likewise, the ablative often shows motion from somewhere, or it's something that is sort of tagging along with the sentence. It's ancillary to it. It gives information about how something is done. The case that is the least consistent and has the most diversity is the ablative case, and that is why it is often the case that gives people the most trouble, because it can really do so many things. So as I said before, this is what we've seen so far. We've seen the nominative as the subject and the predicate nominative with esse. We also see this being used with two of our new verbs, fio, to become, and videor, to seem. But that's about the only places where we see a predicate nominative. The vocative we use to directly address someone, genitive for possession, dative with indirect objects, and with some verbs or adjectives, right? Similis takes a dative, for example, you're similar to something in the dative. The accusative we see as a direct object, we see it with some prepositions, and these new expressions of place and time, of course, can take the accusative for special meanings, and likewise with the ablative we see it with prepositions. We've seen it with comparatives to mean than. We've seen it with means and personal agent, right, that ab, plus the ablative, and place and time as well. And this is all we know so far. But we're going to look at some particular uses. These are uses that are in your textbook. I've also given you a handout about these, and we're going to go over them. I will hold you responsible for the ones that I think are the most critical and the most common. But I do want to go over all of them because you will have example sentences in which all of these will come up. It's not so important that you be able to put a name to them. It is important that you are able to translate them. So we do have this genitive called the partitive genitive, or the genitive of the whole, it's sometimes called. And it's only used with particular nouns. If you imagine that there is a pie chart of all of something in the world, and whatever that category is going to go into the genitive. So, for example, Marcus nihil curaescit. Marcus knows no care. He literally knows nothing of care. And so the kinds of words that are going to take a partitive genitive have to be words that can express some kind of quantity. So some, a little, nothing, too much. Those are the kinds of words that will take a genitive. Latin is much more likely to do this than to just modify a noun with an adjective like no. So we could say he has nihil auri, nothing of gold, for example, instead of saying he has no gold. We also have this use of the genitive called the objective genitive. In this, we often translate it with the word for, and the noun itself that it's associated with has to have some kind of verby idea, where the genitive then that follows is not really possessive, but it's showing the object for that noun. Here's an example to try to make this clearer for you. Marcus amorem equi habet. Marcus has love of his horse. That is, he really has love for his horse. His love is directed to his horse in this case. It's love of his horse. It's not love that the horse possesses. So it's not possessive. It's love that's to the horse. So it's objective genitive. And then we have what's called a genitive of description. And this is really when you're using a noun to modify another noun. And you can see how this works. Marcus est vir magnae virtutis. Marcus is a man of great virtue. That is, he is, what kind of man is he? He's a greatly virtuous man. But when we say this, we're really describing the man. It's not possession. This isn't really hard to translate because we're just going to translate it with of, just as we would translate any other genitive, but it's really describing the man. The objective is the hardest of these because instead of using of, we tend in English to use for to express this idea. We have a couple more genitives to look at. One is called a genitive of characteristic. And this is one that is really maybe one of the most troublesome because you would expect the genitive to be dependent on a noun and there's no noun in sight. One thing that always happens, or almost always happens, is that we have a form of the verb to be, often est, and then we have a genitive with it. Equorum est celeriter currere. It is of horses. That is, it is characteristic of horses. It is the kind of thing horses do to run swiftly. So there's no word in there for characteristic. It's that this is the source of this trait. It is of horses. It pertains to horses. It belongs to horses to run quickly. We also have something called the genitive of value. On your handout, you'll see I've given you there are only a handful of words that use this kind of genitive. So, equum assis aestimo, I value the horse. of a penny. So when we talk about the value of something, we put it in the genitive. And there are just a handful of terms that tend to be used this way in Latin. And then finally, there are some adjectives that take a genitive instead of taking a dative. One of them is this adjective plenos, that means full. So we could say equus plenos caratarum est. The horse is full of carrots. So here is our genitive. And in English we say full of, so does Latin. And for the most part, these aren't tricky either. They tend to correspond to adjectives in English that also like to take of plus a noun. The dative has comparatively fewer uses, and they are in some ways not so important to distinguish one from another because for the most part it is really just referring to something tangentially in a sentence. So we do have something that is called the dative of possession. Just as the genitive of characteristic is always used with the verb to be, the dative of possession is always used with the verb to be. And they use this instead of using a verb like habeo. So Marco equus est. Marcus has a horse. That is literally, there is, est, a horse, equus, for Marcus. Dative, Marco. This is in fact the way that Romans like to say their name. Mihi nomen est. There is a name for me, and then you give that name. Most datives that are not indirect objects are what we call the dative of reference. And this really just refers to a person who is tangentially related to the action of the sentence. So Marco Willem edificant, they are building a house for Marcus. They are building it in reference to Marcus. They are building it in his interest. Sometimes we call these datives of advantage. Sometimes we call them datives of disadvantage. This would be a dative of advantage. They are building the house for Marcus to his advantage. Sometimes things are done to somebody's disadvantage, also in the dative. And finally, the thing that is maybe trickiest is there is this construction called the double dative, where you have two datives. One is a dative of reference. Another is what's called a dative of purpose. And the dative of purpose is only used with abstract ideas. So the dative of reference tends to be an actual person, and the dative of purpose is an abstract concept. And in English, we don't really translate them as datives, as you'll see here. So Marcus patri curae erat. Marcus is our subject, was is our verb. For a care, that's our dative of purpose. To his father, dative of reference. So we would not say he was as a care or for a care or concern to his father. We would just say he was a concern to his father. But this cura is not in the accusative, it's in the dative curae here, because Latin likes this double dative construction. It's going to give you trouble. It gives everyone trouble until you see it enough to get used to it. The accusative, again, does not have a ton of uses outside of being the object of a preposition or being the direct object, but there are a few extra uses. One is a double accusative. This only occurs with a handful of verbs, and it's not hard, but you just need to know that a verb might take this kind of construction. And in general, they are verbs that also might take a double accusative in English, if English still had the accusative. So here are some examples. Regem pecuniam rogavit. He asked the king for money. So he asked two things. He asked the king and he asked money. Geometriam nos docuit. She taught us geometry. So she taught us, she taught geometry, she taught us geometry. So dokeo, drogo, and fakio is another verb that works this way. So he makes me a sandwich. Me and sandwich would both be in the accusative. The accusative of respect is really only used with body parts. And so in English, we would say, I'm hurt in my arm, or he stabbed me in my side. In Latin, we're just going to put that, whatever that part of the body is, into the accusative. So you can see, Marcus manum vulneratus est. So Marcus was wounded at his hand, with respect to his hand, in his hand. We just use the accusative. With respect to his hand, he was injured. No preposition. We use the accusative for extent of space, and this is not unlike extent of time. So if you do something for a length of time, we use the accusative, and so likewise, we use it for space too. And you're always going to have a word that means some length of space, so that is a tip-off. So quinque pedes ambulavit, he walked 5 feet, he walked the extent of 5 feet, he walked for 5 feet. And just as if we had said he walked for 5 hours, quinque horas. And then finally, if you're going to exclaim something, you do it in the accusative. So if you want to say good luck, bonum fortunam, you don't say it in the nominative, you say it in the accusative. This is a direct object. You're saying something like opto, I wish, bonum fortunam. And so all exclamations tend to be in the accusative. And finally, we have the ablative, which has tons and tons of different uses. One of them that's most common is manner. Manner is always used with cum, so that's easy, unless it is modified by an adjective, in which case the cum can drop out. So we could say, magna cum virtute pugnabat, he fought with great bravery. So this magna is actually ablative, modifying virtute, but we could have the cum drop out and we could just say magna virtute pugnabat. He fought with great bravery. If you know those expressions when you graduate from high school or college and it says magna cum laude, that is an ablative of manner. You have graduated with great praise. We also have an ablative of description. And so we can say Marcus est vir magna virtute. He is a man with great virtue. That is, he is a man of great virtue. If you remember from the genitive, we also had a genitive of description. We could put that in the genitive and modify vir. We can also put it in the ablative. It really amounts to the same thing. We also have an ablative of price. If you remember, we used genitive to express value. He is I value him 1 cent, of a cent. But if we're actually talking about a specific price that we paid, we put that into the ablative. Agrum multis aureis vendidit. He sold the field for much gold. Multis aureis. Many gold coins. And finally, we have what's called an ablative of cause. So sometimes if we want to say why someone did something, we can just put that noun in the ablative and that will explain it. So Marcus timore fugit. Marcus fled because of or out of great fear. So he didn't flee with great fear, although he was very fearful, but that explains why he fled. Cause is sometimes the hardest one to identify it because you're likely to try a lot of other things before you figure out that it's the cause, things that aren't going to make as much sense. One final thing related to cause are these words causa and gratia. So causa means cause or reason, gratia means favor or thanks, but they are sometimes preceded by the genitive to mean because of or for the sake of. So if you know the MGM logo with that big lion, ars gratia artis, it really should be ars artis gratia, but it means art for the sake of art. So here's our gratia in the ablative, here is our genitive that goes with it. It acts almost like a preposition. And we could say, belli causa Marcus egressus est. Marcus left, there's our verb, causa belli, for the sake of the war, because of the war. So those are a handful of the most common uses of cases. It is a lot to throw at you all at once when you thought you knew exactly what all these cases did, and now you find out there are all kinds of other things that they can do. And there are, of course, still more things that they can do, but these are by far the most common. So we're going to spend a lot of time practicing with these, but please do familiarize yourself with the different things that these cases can do and keep them in mind as we begin our practice.